Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Blue Book Records. So, in this rule, we're talking about books, reports, and other non periodic materials. So, the basic rule is, for example, if you had a book, we're using small caps or large and small caps, however you like to call it. We start with the author's name, followed by a comma and a space, the title of a book, a space, the pin site, another space, and then in parentheses, you might have a few things, but that we'll talk about in a moment. But basically, you at least want the year of publication, followed by closed parentheses and a period. So with the author, and this is rule 5.1, we always want to give the author's full name just like it appears in the publication. And Blue Book says we add the designations, junior, the third, and using the author's convention on punctuation with regard to those designations. Blue Book says don't use designations like professor or doctor, even if it appears in the title page. Again, we always use large and small caps. So we'll have the name of the author, followed by a comma, title of the book, pin site, and in parentheses we'll have some information, but at least we have the year. So when we're citing a single volume in a multi-volume work, we'll only use the authors of the cited volume. And before the author's name, we'll put the volume number. So in their example, they start with volume 4. They have the author, title of the book, pin site, and then parenthetical information. Now, if there are two authors, then we list the author's names just like they appear on the title page, and we separate it by an ampersand, followed by a comma, title of the book, and pin site, then parenthetical information with a period. The Blue Book states if there's a alternative relationship between the authors, like with or as told to, use that phrase to separate the author's name rather than the ampersand. Now, if we have more than two authors, then we're only going to use the first author's name followed by et al. Unless the listing all the authors is going to be relevant for you in your citation. And in that situation, so if you have three or more, you will use the comma to separate the authors, followed by, but between the last two authors, you'll only have an ampersand. And we don't use a comma with the ampersand. So when we're using et al., we don't use a comma, and there's only a period after the al. So in the example, they have A, Leo, Levin, no comma, et, space, all, period, comma. and then the rest of the citation. Same thing goes when you're referencing a single author of a single volume of a multi-volume work. You place that at the beginning, place the authors and the work, pin site, and parenthetical. Now, if you have an institutional author, meaning that a particular institution published the work, you'll begin with that institutional author's complete name, abbreviating according to Rule 15.1d. But when there's an individual author that's credited on behalf of the institution, you'll start with that author's name, followed by the institution's name, set off by a comma, and then followed by the book or whatever you're citing to, pin site, and parenthetical. Abbreviations. So we abbreviate. Blue Book suggests abbreviating the name of an institutional author only if the result will be ambiguous. Then we're using T6 and T10 to inform us about those abbreviations. So now when we're talking about an editor or translator, we'll always give the full name of the editor or translator, followed by ED period for editor or TRANS period for translator. In that order, they could both apply, so you would put them both. And using that in the parenthetical information after the citation. And in that parenthetical information, we're not using small caps. So in their example, they have Alan Sheridan Translators, Vintage Books, which is the publisher, 2nd edition, 1995. And remember our conventions when using second and then abbreviating edition appropriately. If there are two editors, set off by ampersand, and editors should be EDS period. If there's more than one editor, then we're using a tall. No commas in that situation except for after editors. If there's an editor and a translator, set off the editor by a comma. Translator, set that off between the publisher and the year with no comma set off. Same thing if there's institutional editors, meaning no one person is credited with the editing or translating, then substitute the name for the institution with the name of the individual author. So Rule 15.3, the title. We cite the full main title as it appears on the title page. And we capitalize according to Rule 8. If it's not in English, then we look to Rule 20. we don't abbreviate words or omit articles in the title. And again, we're using large and small caps. Again, if we're citing a single volume of a multi-volume work, give the main title of the volume cited. Blue Book reminds us if the title of the work ends with a numeral, then the page number should be set off by a comma and the word at. Otherwise, neither is necessary. And there's an example under Rule 15.3 at the end. So now moving to Rule 15.4. This is the edition, publisher, and date information. So Blue Book says we are always citing the latest edition of a work. Unless you want to cite an earlier edition, or that's part of your purpose, right? It's relevant to your assertion. Then you can use an earlier edition. So when there's only one edition, we only will cite to the year of publication of that edition. Sometimes there may be a different printing involved that's relevant for purposes of that citation. Then give the printing designation, followed by the year. So Blue Book reminds us that if the title of the report contains the year of publication, then you'll repeat both. Don't omit one or the other. Now, if there's multiple editions, then this is where we indicate the edition that you're using, followed by the year. Again, remember that when we're using fourth or second, we talked about the abbreviations in a previous video on this. We're not using superscripts for anything, and just be aware when you're second edition how you're abbreviating that. So if there's editions available not by the original publisher, then we indicate the editor, translator, the publisher, the edition cited. If it's not the first, then the date of publication of the edition. Sometimes you'll have photo duplicated reprints to the original. If so, indicate that. Photo duplicated reprints, you can see the abbreviation in 15.4b. So Blue Book states that if you're using a published work, a publication that was published before 1900, we cite to a scholarly modern edition, according to Rule 15.4a. If there's no modern edition, cite to the first edition. And finally, in Rule 15.4 supplements, we need to cite pocket parts and bound supplements according to Rule 3.1. And there's a couple of examples there. So now, shorter works in a collection. This is Rule 15.5.1. So when we're citing to a shorter work within a volume of collected works by various authors, then we list the author's name. We're not in small caps world anymore. And set off by a comma, followed by the title of the shorter work in italics, set off by another comma with the word in italics. Then moving to, now we move back to small caps world. We might have to cite the volume number, the title, the name of the volume, followed by the pin site, and then our parenthetical information. Same thing if there are two authors in a shorter work within the volume, you would list the two authors, set off by an ampersand. We're not in small caps mode again. Then set off by a comma, italics of the title, set off by a comma, in. Now moving back to small caps world, and then listing the title of the larger volume. The only difference is now if all of the shorter works in the volume are by the same author, then that author's name is in small caps, set off by a comma, and then back to regular font in italics, the name of the shorter collection, in, then back to small caps, and then listing the name of the larger work. So in Rule 15.5.2, collected documents, we use the term reprinted in to cite collected materials that were previously published. So instead of in, like we were talking about before, we would just add reprinted in. So if the documents originally were unpublished, like letters, speeches, manuscripts, diaries, things like that, you would cite this as you would any other shorter work in a collection. But then you would add a description of the document in ordinary Roman, followed by the date of the particular document or identifying information. Right. So the example they had is letter from Virginia Woolf to so and so, or letter from so and so to so and so, and then adding the date to that. So now Rule 15.6, the prefaces, forewords, introductions, and epilogues. So they basically give an example of how to do that in Rule 15.6. So here, for example, they have L. Maria Child, comma, introduction to, and then introduction is in italics there. So here we're talking about an introduction. And then listing the citation as usual. Note where the italics and regular font end. So here we would have, usually you'll see in italics, introduction would be in italics, and then introduction to would not be in italics. So introduction to Harriet A. Jacobs. And in the second example, they had preface to the first edition in italics, and then of in regular, of Paul M. His work. So Rule 15.7, serial number. So if there's a series issued by the author, include the serial number as part of the title. And then abbreviating it according to Table T16. So in the examples here, they have publication number 8732 or leaflet number 55. Include that in the title. So special citation forms. This is Rule 15.8. This is where the search function is valuable on the online version of the Blue Book. So for example, if you want to cite to the Bible or the Federalist Papers, one of the first thing I do is see if there's a special citation form for that. So here you can see things like Black's Law Dictionary, Ballantyne's Law Dictionary, Amger, CJS, the Federalist Papers, the Manual for Complex Litigation prepared by the Federal Judicial Center, the Bible. There's a particular way to cite the Bible. Indicating what version you're using, that sort of thing. Shakespeare, if you're citing to Shakespeare, that's in this section, and the Blue Book, right? So how do you cite the Blue Book? So that will be in Rule 15.8. It's always good. I'm always looking for that one. Electronic databases and online sources. So when using a commercial database, something like Westlaw or LexisNexis, so we use the complete citation as usual, and then as well as to the citation to the database. If the database gives a unique identifier, then use that as well. So the question is, okay, do we use, if it's available in print and in the commercial electronic database, you can feel free to cite to both if you think it gives the reader a little bit extra help in finding that citation. Internet and online sources. So sometimes books will be found online. Note that this is different from the Internet Electronic Media section in Rule 18. But if there's an ebook that differs in format from the printed book, and that's online, you can't treat those the same. You have to choose the one you're using, right? And they have a few examples under B. So basically, you're adding the URL and for an ebook, you're adding the parenthetical ebook at the end. Sometimes ebooks use location numbers rather than page numbers. Just use LOC period to indicate where the reader can find the information in the ebook. So now short citation forms. This is Rule 15.10. Once we've cited in full, we can employ the id form or supra form and subsequent citations. And then check back to Rule 4 on citation forms. If you're using shorter works in a collection, consult Rule 15.10.1 in this rule section. The thing you have to think about when you're citing short forms in a collection, or rather using short forms in for works in a collection, you have to think about whether it was the sole authority within the immediately preceding citation if you're using id, right? So if you're using supra, you're citing it as the collection as a whole, right? But if you're citing the shorter work in the collection, then when you use supra, you need to include the author's name in the short citation. So you can see that in example footnote 4 and 6. I would consult these footnotes 1 through 8 in Rule 15.10 because they show clearly how to use the short citation forms in a variety of different ways. So that's it for Rule 15. Thanks, everybody. We'll take a short break and then move on to Rule 16.